A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was looking through the notes for today, and Daniel's prompt really hits on something that sounds completely backwards if you just look at the labels on the bottle. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the paradoxical effect of ADHD stimulants and non-stimulants like Strattera, causing sleepiness or extreme fatigue in patients. You would think if you were taking something that is technically an amphetamine or a potent norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, you would be bouncing off the walls, or at the very least wide awake. But for a significant number of people, it is the exact opposite. They take their pill, and 30 minutes later, they are ready for the best nap of their lives. It is the paradoxical nap, and it is a phenomenon that leaves a lot of patients feeling like their brains are broken in a way that even medicine cannot fix.
It is one of those things that drives clinicians and patients crazy because it feels so counterintuitive. I am Herman Poppleberry, and I have actually been digging into the neurobiology of this for a while now because the term paradoxical is almost a misnomer once you understand what is happening at the synaptic level. We call it paradoxical because we are comparing the ADHD brain's reaction to the neurotypical brain's reaction. If you give a stimulant to someone without ADHD, their catecholamine levels, specifically dopamine and norepinephrine, shoot past the optimal range and into the red zone. That is where you get the classic jittery, high-energy, hyper-arousal state. But in the ADHD brain, we are starting from a deficit, and that changes the entire trajectory of the drug's effect. We are not pushing the system into overdrive, we are trying to bring it up to a functional baseline.
So it is like trying to fill a bucket that has a hole in the bottom. You are not overflowing the bucket, you are just finally getting it to a level where the pump can actually work. But why does that lead to sleep? If I finally have enough dopamine to function, shouldn't I be out there getting things done instead of face planting onto the sofa? It seems like a waste of a good prescription if you are just using it to facilitate a dreamless slumber.
To understand that, we have to define the paradoxical effect within the context of catecholamine regulation. Catecholamines are a category of signaling molecules that include dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. In a neurotypical brain, these chemicals are usually well regulated to maintain a state of alert readiness. In the ADHD brain, there is often a chronic state of underarousal in the prefrontal cortex. Now, that sounds weird because people with ADHD often look over-aroused. They are fidgety, they are talking fast, they are jumping from task to task. But that outward hyperactivity is often a compensatory mechanism. The brain is starving for stimulation, so it creates its own by seeking out novelty or physical movement. When you introduce a stimulant like methylphenidate or an amphetamine, you are essentially providing the stimulation the brain was hunting for. For many, the result isn't more energy, it is the cessation of the hunt.
I see. So the hyper part of ADHD is actually the brain's way of trying to wake itself up because it is bored or understimulated at a chemical level. When the drug does that job for the brain finally says, okay, I can stop doing all that extra work now.
And this brings us to the signal-to-noise ratio hypothesis, which is central to understanding why stimulants can feel like a sedative. Think of the ADHD brain as a radio that is permanently stuck between stations. You have all this static and white noise, which is basically background neural firing that is not tied to any specific task or goal. That static is exhausting. It is what we often call mental chatter. The 5 different songs playing at once, the worry about the laundry, the sudden memory of a conversation from 3rd grade. Your brain is working overtime just to filter out that noise so you can focus on one single thought. When you introduce a stimulant, you are increasing the tonic levels of these neurotransmitters. This effectively turns up the signal of the important thoughts and turns down the noise of the background chatter.
I love that analogy because it explains the relief people feel. If you have been living in a room with a loud, buzzing industrial fan for 20 years, and someone finally turns it off, the first thing you want to do is sleep. The sudden silence is a sedative in itself, because your nervous system finally feels like it can stop fighting the environment. It is like the brain has been running a marathon while sitting still, and the medication finally lets it sit down.
That is a huge part of it. There is a specific neurochemical mechanism called the inverted U hypothesis, which we touched on back in episode 834 when we talked about the chemistry of focus. Imagine a graph where the vertical axis is cognitive performance, and the horizontal axis is dopamine and norepinephrine levels. If you are too far to the left, you are under-aroused, distracted, and seeking stimulation. This is the baseline for many with ADHD. If you are too far to the right, you are overstimulated, anxious, and stressed. The goal of medication is to land right in the middle of that peak, the sweet spot of optimal arousal. For many people with ADHD, reaching that peak feels like a profound sense of calm. The brain stops frantically searching for the next hit of dopamine because it finally has a steady supply. That transition from seeking to stable can feel exactly like sleepiness because the physical tension associated with ADHD drops away.
Is there a difference in how this works between the stimulants and something like Strattera? Because Strattera is not a stimulant in the traditional sense. It is a selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. It doesn't give you that immediate kick that something like Vyvanse might. Yet people report being absolutely floored by fatigue when they start it.
The mechanism for Strattera, or atomoxetine, is actually quite fascinating because it targets the prefrontal cortex specifically. Unlike stimulants, which increase dopamine in the striatum, the part of the brain involved in reward and movement, atomoxetine increases norepinephrine and dopamine primarily in the prefrontal cortex. It does this because, in that specific part of the brain, dopamine is actually cleared away by norepinephrine transporters. So by blocking those transporters, you get a boost in both chemicals where you need them for executive function. However, Strattera also has a direct effect on the locus ceruleus. The locus ceruleus is the brain's primary source of norepinephrine and a major regulator of the sleep-wake cycle. For some people, that shift in norepinephrine signaling can actually trigger a sedative response, especially during the first few weeks of treatment as the brain tries to figure out what to do with this new abundance of signal.
That is the part that trips people up. They start a new medication, hoping for a productivity boost, and instead, they feel like they are walking through a fog for a month. You mentioned the first few weeks. Does the body eventually calibrate, or are some people just destined to be sleepy on these meds?
It is usually a titration issue or a timing issue. With Strattera, it can take 4 to 8 weeks to reach a steady state in the blood. During that time, the brain is downregulating its own receptors in response to the increased levels of norepinephrine. It is a massive recalibration of the autonomic nervous system. But there is also a secondary physical effect we have to talk about, which is blood pressure and heart rate. Stimulants usually raise heart rate, but in some patients there is a compensatory vagal response. The body sees the spike in heart rate and overcorrects by activating the parasympathetic nervous system, which is your rest and digest mode. So you have this internal tug of war where the drug is saying go, but the body's defense mechanism is saying slow down. This can lead to a literal drop in blood pressure in some individuals, which results in that heavy, sleepy feeling.
I've heard people describe a coffee nap where they drink an espresso and then sleep for 20 minutes. They say they wake up feeling more refreshed than if they had just slept. Is that the same thing? Using a small hit of a stimulant to quiet the brain enough to actually drop into a deep sleep cycle?
It is a perfect behavioral analog. Caffeine blocks adenosine receptors, which are the chemicals that build up to make you feel sleepy. But for an ADHD brain, that caffeine hit also provides just enough of a dopamine bump to stop the internal restlessness. It is why you see people with ADHD who can drink a double-shot latte at 9 o'clock at night and go right to sleep, while a neurotypical person would be staring at the ceiling until 3 in the morning. It is about reaching that threshold of neurological quiet. If your brain is too loud to sleep, a stimulant acts as a pair of noise, canceling headphones. Without the meds, the ADHD brain is often too busy thinking about why it can't sleep to actually fall asleep.
So if someone is experiencing this, how do they distinguish between the medication working correctly by calming them down and the medication being at the wrong dose or just being the wrong drug entirely? Because I can see someone thinking, well, I am quiet now, but I am also useless because I am asleep on the rug.
This is where we get into the difference between therapeutic calm and adverse sedation. Therapeutic calm feels like your thoughts are organized. You feel like you could do work if you wanted to, but you also feel like you could relax if you wanted to. It is the gift of choice. Adverse sedation, or what people sometimes call the zombie effect, feels like a heavy weight on your limbs. It feels like your brain is foggy rather than quiet. If you are so tired that you cannot function, that is usually a sign that the dose is either too high, causing you to overshoot that inverted U peak and land in the overstimulated but shutting down zone, or it is a sign of a metabolic crash.
We talked about that crash in episode 838, the afternoon crash. If you have a fast metabolism, you might be processing that medication so quickly that you are hitting a withdrawal state just a few hours after taking it. Your brain goes from having this nice steady signal back to the static, and the sudden return of the noise is exhausting.
And that rebound effect is often more intense than the baseline ADHD symptoms. It is like the brain was leaning against a door, and suddenly the door is pulled away. You fall over. There is also the issue of what the medication is masking. A lot of people with ADHD are chronically sleep deprived because their brains won't shut up at night. When they take a stimulant in the morning and it finally quiets the chatter, the brain says, "Oh, thank goodness, we are finally safe and quiet. Let's catch up on those 5 years of missed REM sleep." In that case, the medication isn't making you tired, it is just revealing how tired you already were.
That is a profound point. It is like the medication is a mirror. If you have been running on adrenaline and stress hormones for years to compensate for a lack of dopamine, the second you provide that dopamine, the adrenaline drops and you realize you are absolutely spent. It is a debt that has to be paid back. I imagine this is particularly true for people who have been undiagnosed for a long time. They have been white-knuckling their way through life, and the medication is the first time they have been able to let go of that tension.
There is also a metabolic cost to these drugs too. They increase your basal metabolic rate. Your brain is consuming more glucose, your heart is working a bit harder. Even if you are sitting still, your body is running a bit hotter. If you aren't increasing your caloric intake or staying hydrated, you are going to hit a wall. I have seen cases where people think their medication is failing, but they are actually just dehydrated and hypoglycemic because the stimulant suppressed their appetite and they haven't eaten since breakfast. The fatigue isn't from the drug, it is from the lack of fuel.
Let's pivot to the practical side of this. If a listener is experiencing this paradoxical sleepiness, what should they be looking for in their own data? Because we always talk about being your own advocate and bringing good information to your doctor. You can't just go in and say, "I am tired." You need more than that to get a helpful adjustment.
You need a log, and specifically, you need a timing log. You should track exactly when you take the dose, when the sleepiness hits, and how long it lasts. If the sleepiness happens 30 minutes after the dose, it is likely a primary effect of the drug reaching the brain and providing that sudden calm or a vagal response. If it happens 4 hours later, it is likely a crash or a metabolic issue. You also want to track your heart rate and blood pressure if you can. If your blood pressure is dropping when the medication kicks in, that is a very specific physical response that your doctor needs to know about. It might mean you need to switch to a different class of medication or adjust your salt and water intake.
And what about the mental state during that sleepiness? How do you describe that to a doctor?
That is the most important part. Ask yourself, is my mind quiet or is it foggy? If you feel like you can think clearly but your body just wants to rest, that is a sign the neurochemistry is actually heading in the right direction, but the dosage or the delivery mechanism might need adjustment. Maybe you need an extended release version instead of an immediate release, one to avoid that sudden spike in overcorrection by the parasympathetic nervous system. Or maybe you are like some patients who actually take a small dose of a stimulant right before bed to help them sleep. It sounds insane to the general public, but for some ADHD brains, it is the only way to turn off the lights. I have seen case studies of patients who struggled with lifelong insomnia until they were prescribed a low-dose stimulant at 10 o'clock at night. It allowed their prefrontal cortex to finally engage the inhibitory pathways that tell the rest of the brain to go to sleep.
It is such a departure from the way these drugs are portrayed in the media. You always see the college student staying up for 48 hours straight to cram for an exam. You never see the person who takes their Adderall and finally feels peaceful enough to take a nap. It goes back to that conservative view of personal responsibility and understanding your own biology. You can't just follow a one-size-fits-all protocol when you are dealing with something as complex as the human brain.
The individual variability is massive. We are moving toward a future where we might use genetic markers to predict this. There are specific variations in the COMT gene, which stands for catechol O methyltransferase. This enzyme breaks down dopamine in the prefrontal cortex. If you have a high-activity version of that gene, you clear dopamine very quickly, and you might need a much higher dose of a stimulant just to reach baseline. If you have a low-activity version, you are a slow metabolizer of dopamine. In that case, even a tiny dose might push you over the edge into that overstimulated sleepiness or a zombie state. We are not quite at the point where every doctor is running a genetic panel before writing a prescription, but the research is there, and it explains why your friend might feel like a superhero on 20 milligrams while you feel like you need a nap on 5.
It feels like we are finally moving away from the idea that ADHD is just a behavioral problem and acknowledging that it is a fundamental difference in how the brain manages its energy and its filters. If your filter is broken, the world is too loud. If the medication fixes the filter, the world finally gets quiet. And for someone who has never known a quiet world, that silence is the most relaxing thing imaginable.
That is the goal. And I think for people on Strattera, the takeaway is patience. Because it is a non-stimulant and it works on those receptor upregulations, the fatigue you feel in week 2 might be gone by week 6. It is a slow motion adjustment. But if you are on a stimulant and you are consistently falling asleep every day, you have to look at the inverted U. You are either not quite at the peak yet or you have sailed right past it. It is also worth checking your sleep hygiene. If the medication is quieting the brain, are you getting better sleep at night? Because if you are, that daytime sleepiness might just be a transition period while your body heals from years of poor sleep hygiene caused by the ADHD itself.
That is a great point. We often look at these things in a vacuum, but the brain is a holistic system. If the medication helps you achieve a state of flow during the day, you are going to be more tired at night in a healthy way. The paradoxical effect is really only a paradox if you assume every brain starts at the same baseline. Once you realize we are starting from a place of chronic understimulation and high background noise, the calming effect of a stimulant makes perfect sense. It is not an upper. It is a stabilizer.
I love that. It is a stabilizer. If you were a car that was idling at 4,000 RPMs just to keep from stalling, and someone fixed the engine so it could idle at 800, the car would seem much quieter. It wouldn't be broken, it would finally be working correctly. The engine finally stops straining. And for the listeners, if you are struggling with this, don't just assume the medication isn't for you. It might be that the dose is just slightly off, or your body is reacting to the sudden lack of stress. It is a journey of titration.
Well, this has been a deep dive into something that I think will resonate with a lot of people who have felt like outliers even within the ADHD community. It is a weird feeling to be the person who falls asleep when everyone else is getting a buzz. It makes you feel like the medication is failing, when in reality it might be the first sign that it is actually working.
It just means your brain has its own unique set of operating instructions. The more you understand those instructions, the less paradoxical your life becomes.
Before we wrap up, I want to give a big thanks to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes, and a huge thank you to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. Their support allows us to keep digging into these complex topics every week.
If you found this helpful, we have a whole archive of related episodes. Episode 8 and 34 on the chemistry of focus is a great companion to this one, and episode 8 and 38 covers the afternoon crash in more detail. You can find all of them at myweirdprompts.com.
We are also on Telegram if you want to get notified the second a new episode drops. Just search for My Weird Prompts and join the channel. We love hearing your feedback and your own stories of paradoxical reactions.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We will be back next time with another prompt from Daniel.
See you then.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts.